Hello and welcome to this Friday's Independent Sage news briefing. Though announcing yesterday that extra precautions may have to remain in place, Boris Johnson is still intending, of course, to lift the majority of restrictions on the 19th of July, with the new Health Secretary, Sajid Javid, declaring that the plan is irreversible. This has prompted extreme concern from many voices in the scientific community, including members of Independent Sage, of course, particularly as we are seeing no sign at all of the Delta variant letting up. And a particular area of concern is schools, where children are unvaccinated and largely maskless, and mitigating measures such as effective and monitored ventilation are minimal. Another area of concern is mass events, which are still not proven to be safe. Independent Sage has written an open letter to Sir Patrick Vallance asking for the process assessing the safety of mass events to be reconsidered. This letter can be found on our Twitter feed and our website. And Professor John Drury, who is a member of the Independent Sage Behavioural Group, is going to introduce that document shortly. However, as usual, we're going to look at some facts and figures to begin with. Over to you, Professor Christina Pargle.
Hi. Right. So today's figures, nothing particularly good. I'm going to start with vaccinations this week and then look at cases, then hospitalizations and deaths, and then go back into cases and really ask, who are they, where are they, and why should we care about them? So starting with vaccination data, this is just the number of daily first and second doses given by day. You can see that the overall number, this grey line, is coming down. We're giving fewer jabs now. Part of that is far fewer second jabs, which isn't surprising because we're kind of picking up these first jabs from April and May where we weren't doing that many. But first jabs, which is the blue bars, are also coming down. Which might be a combination of demand, but also constraints in how much Pfizer and Moderna we have available to us. In terms of looking at the overall population, we're kind of at about 50% of our population fully vaccinated with 2 doses, somewhere between 17 and 20%, depending on nation, with 1 dose. But about a third of our population, which obviously includes children, is still unvaccinated. As we just look at ages from 18 up, this is in England from NHS England data, you can see with the blue bars here that we are now making good inroads into young adults over 18, which is really, really good news, but obviously many of them still do not have 2 doses. The people over 50 have excellent uptake, very well protected. That's really good news. But in the 40s, we haven't got to over 90% in first doses, and in the 30s, we haven't got to 80% in first doses. So that is something that we do really want to keep an eye on. We need to, because of Delta, really get to about 85% plus of our population being immune. Looking at first dose coverage for over 50s by ethnicity, I know we present this quite a lot. I've added in the percentage change over the last month in orange, and you can see that any progress towards addressing this disparity by ethnicity is really, really slow. First doses are barely moving at all. So these kind of disparities remain, and it means that there are communities that remain in the UK that are underprotected. So cases. Well, the number of new UK confirmed cases, people who've had a positive test, is continuing to go up. We're now at levels that basically exceed the November wave and kind of back in kind of mid-December type territory. Looking at it by nation, this is a number of cases per 100,000 people per week for the 4 nations. Every nation is now going up. And what you can't see is that actually every nation is going up at a similar rate now. So what we'll do is we'll move this scale on the vertical axis onto what's called a log scale, where here you're going up in powers of 10, so from 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000 cases. And the reason you do that is because when you have exponential growth, then a straight line on this kind of plot means you're in exponential growth at a constant rate. And so what you can see is that over the last week, the growth in the 4 nations is approximately parallel. And that means that effectively we're all growing at the same rate now, which is about 70% week on week growth. This is the percentage of people who are testing positive. This only goes up to the 26th of June. So certainly I would expect, say, Northern Ireland to go up, but basically every nation is now going up. It's not just that we're doing loads of testing. The positivity rates are going up in Scotland. They're almost 10% now. That's high. So what does this mean, right? So the 19th of July is the last stage of the roadmap, which seems almost certain to go ahead. That's 18 days away. Again, this is on a log scale, so we've got, powers of 10 on this axis, so we can see this this exponential growth as a straight line here. The most recent week, cases doubled in 9 days. That growth has accelerated. So these are 9-day intervals. We went from 4K to 7K to 10K, so to 21,000. This is 7-day averages cases as of yesterday. So if we project that 9-day doubling forward, that's 2 more doublings between now and the 19th of July. So if we project that forward, it means that by the 19th of July, we'll have a 7-day average of around 90,000 cases a day. If we now go back to the kind of a normal linear way of looking at it, this is what that looks like. And this is what it looks like when you compare it to everything since the 1st of September 2020. So at the current rate of growth, in 18 days' time, we'll be at cases far higher than we've had so far. Now, that may seem, and it may feel, frankly, unbelievable. It would mean effectively 1 million new infections in the next 18 days at the current rate of growth. But as we've just seen, we've got about 12 million people currently on 1 dose who aren't very well protected from infection. We've got 22 million people on no doses. These are all mostly young people. Even assuming about 20% of them have had COVID already, that's still 25 million potentially susceptible people. And schools are still open for 3 more weeks of term. The pubs are open. A lot of things are open. The football is on, everyone is out and about and socializing. We don't actually have that many measures in place right now. So although eventually vaccination will absolutely no doubt bring these numbers down, are they going to do it over the next 18 days? Even if we assume growth slows again to about 50% a week, and the latest Public Health England report on the variants said that Delta grew by 50%, which was sequencing a subset of cases, you're still at about 80,000 cases on the 18th and the 19th of July. Even to get down to 40, 50,000 cases by then, you would need growth to slow a lot from where it is now over the next week or 2. Okay, but let's look at hospitalizations and deaths. This is the number of people in hospital per million people for the UK nations. And you can see here that this is a much more rosy picture, if you like. Hospitalizations are going up, but they are much, much, much lower than they would be without vaccination, right? There's no doubt about that. For equivalent levels of infection, we are at several hundred per million people in hospital, as you can see from here, and we're nowhere near that now. That said, it is going up. In Scotland, the number of people is going up, and that's been accelerating. It's going up in England. It's not yet visible in Wales and Northern Ireland, but their cases started increasing a few weeks after Scotland and England. If we look at regional admissions in England, you can see basically hospitalizations are going up in every region, again in the northwest after a bit of a fall, rapidly in the northeast and Yorkshire, and very rapidly in the last week in London. Looking at deaths, again, this is a much happier picture, if you like. Deaths remain extremely low. For equivalent case numbers, they were at a few hundred a day back in November. And we're nowhere near that at all. And if we zoom in just to the most recent couple of months, you can see that they are slowly starting to go up, but from very, staying at very small numbers. And again, that is the vaccine program. That's a consequence of the very high coverage of vaccination that we have in our older and more vulnerable population, which is a good thing. But that said, we know that hospitalizations and deaths are lagged. They'll come, 2 to 3 to 4 weeks after cases. So the most recent rises that we've seen in cases are not yet showing up in these graphs. So we should expect these to keep going up over the next few weeks. So let's go back to cases, the who and the where, and the why should we care. So the who is very clear age difference now. This is Public Health England data in England. And you can see that the under 20s have the highest case rates, but closely followed now by the 20 to 59-year-olds and going up very rapidly. And the over 60s is going up, but much more slowly and also at much lower levels. In a bit more kind of granular data and 5-year age bands, you can see again that the highest cases are basically between the 10 to 29-year-olds and cases going up, but they are now going up in every age band. And even though rates are highest in 15 to 29-year-olds, the most rapid week-on-week increase was in the 5 to 9-year-olds, which went up 66% to the 25th of June, followed by the 10 to 14-year-olds, which went up 58% in the week to 25th of June. So this is only up to 25th of June, so it doesn't include the most recent 5-6 days, and growth has been accelerating. So we would expect these numbers to go up next time we have a data cut available. This matches the Office of National Infection data that was released today to 26th of June that also show increases in young people, particularly school age 12 to 24 years old. So this is people who are tested randomly every week. So it doesn't depend on symptoms and it doesn't depend on people coming forward for testing. So this is yet another confirmation that it's in our young people that basically we're getting most of these infections. School outbreaks from Public Health England show really big increases since half term. We're back to about the levels of outbreaks that we saw in December last year. And as I said, we've still got 3 weeks left of term. So I'm not quite sure where it's going to go, to be honest. And this is unsurprisingly reflected in the high number of children who are now absent from school due to COVID, either because they have COVID or they're isolating as a contact of a case. So almost 400,000 children off school in the week to 24th of June, and expect that to be higher last week. I don't know about you, but pretty much all my friends who are parents either have children that are isolating or are just dreading the call that they're going to have to isolate over the next couple of weeks. If we look at Scotland and the age breakdown there, you can see again cases are heavily concentrated in young people, particularly the 20 to 24-year-olds. Now, Scotland schools finished, I think, a week ago. So I think that will help cases there, that they won't be seeing spread through schools. But we do know that with the European Championships on in football, there is a lot of spread through socialising and going to see games together there. Recently, Public Health Scotland linked 2,000 Scottish COVID cases to football, particularly the England-Scotland match. And it's not surprising if you think that when people go to see football, whether it's at a friend's house or in the pub or actually at the game, it involves drinking and hugging and shouting and singing, which are all things that we know make it easier for COVID to infect others. So where are the cases? Well, they're in most places, heavily concentrated in central and the borders of Scotland and the northeast, northwest of England. And also now we're just starting to see new hotspots in the top of Northern Ireland, and then Cornwall in the southwest of England. Looking at English regions, again, you can see really very rapid increase recently in the northeast that's now overtaken the northwest, and also rapid increases in Yorkshire and Humber. So yet again, we're seeing a situation where the north of England is disproportionately affected by COVID. But looking at local authority level, there's maybe only let's look at this graph. Literally 4 local authorities that did not see cases go up in the week to the 26th of June. So cases are going up everywhere in England. So why should we care? And many people are saying it doesn't matter anymore if infections go up. So Boris Johnson said, yesterday that the UK's vaccine rollout has broken the link between infections and deaths. So, that's partly why he's insisting that we definitely go forward on July 19th. JCVI scientists said we should stop even publishing daily case updates as the virus is no longer an important cause of mortality. The same guy actually said that children are better off catching COVID than being vaccinated. And effectively, the UK is confident about July reopening. The argument is being made all over the place that infections don't matter anymore, that we shouldn't care if we get to 100,000 infections a day, because we're not going to see the same level of hospitalizations and deaths than we did in January. So does it matter if infections go up? Well, I think it does. Independent Sage thinks it does. So for various reasons that I'm just going to cover quickly here. Hospitalizations and deaths are far, far lower than they would be without vaccination. That is really good news, but they're still rising, right? More people will get very sick and use hospital. Some of those people will die. And if you let infections get high enough, it can still get to a level where it can stress the NHS. And even if it doesn't overwhelm the NHS in the way that it did in January, it's still bad for the people who actually get sick enough to need hospital. It's not good to go to hospital. And a lot of people in hospital with COVID end up with long-term problems. But it's also bad for the exhausted healthcare staff that have already lived through various waves over the last year and are now trying to get through the backlog. We already know A&Es are overloaded in many hospitals in the country. So any additional stress will stress the system with COVID. And then there's long COVID. The ONS yesterday released its latest report on long COVID, and it reports 1 million people living with long COVID in England. Of these, over 850,000 had symptoms for at least 12 weeks, and 385,000 for over a year. 2/3 of people said it adversely affected their daily lives, and almost a fifth, 178,000 said it limited their activities a lot. So what does that mean? What is long COVID? Well, the most common symptoms are fatigue, which more than half of people with long COVID report, then shortness of breath, muscle aches, and about 1/3 of people report difficulty concentrating. It makes your life just that much harder to live. It's more frequent in women, in people over 35, and people living in deprived areas. For those working in healthcare, probably because they're more exposed, and also those with other health conditions already are more likely to get long COVID. But it is still common in young people. The previous ONS report, the one in April, estimated that out of people who tested positive, 7 to 8% of 2 to 15-year-olds and 12% of 17 to 24-year-olds and 16 to 18% of everyone else had symptoms for more than 12 weeks. That's 3 months. That's quite a lot of people. So for every million new cases, and remember, we might get 1 million new cases just in the next 18 days, between 100,000 and 200,000 people could end up with long COVID, depending a bit on how old the people are who are getting it. And many of those people will find their ability to study or work has been affected. And especially if you're thinking about our younger people who are at school, who are at university, who are just starting out in their career, that is a really big deal. Or any of those people in more deprived areas who rely on being able to go to work every day and do not have access to sick pay or support if they can't work. And then the longer term consequences of COVID are yet unknown. We don't really know what happens to people years down the line. We do know that COVID can and does affect pretty much every organ at times. Deprivation is also why we should care. We already know that cases are highest in more deprived areas. We know that people from more deprived areas have lower vaccination rates and more vulnerable to getting sick from COVID and more likely to get long COVID. We know that education of children in more deprived communities is more disrupted and with less ability to compensate for missed school. The government promised support for children in deprived areas to learn from home with laptop support, free internet, catch up last summer. None of it happened. So by allowing COVID just to rip through our population, we know that we're going to be even further exacerbating the inequalities. And then there's variants, right? Every new case provides a chance for COVID to mutate further. Delta went from 0 to more than 90% of cases in the UK in 10 weeks. And it's put us in a worse situation by far. It's more infectious, it's more severe, and it's more vaccine resistant. And as COVID is now going through our children, any new mutation that can affect their vaccinated parents and then those parents' peer group will gain a selection advantage, right? It's just a really stupid thing to do to think we can have millions of infections and everything's fine. And the government is allowing cases to spiral in the full knowledge that we have safe and highly effective vaccines after 2 doses. We have the vaccines. It's not inevitable that everybody gets COVID. Pfizer is now approved for anyone over 12. There are trials of Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca in children under 11. They all started about February or March. It's hopefully they can report soon on safety and efficacy. We know that we have a way out. And the government is not only not strengthening the basic public health measures that we know work, good contact tracing, support for isolation, ventilation, it's planning on removing measures, right? On the 19th of July, no more social distancing, no masks. They're trying to reduce the need to isolate. They're also supporting mass events and the opening of venues such as nightclubs without any kind of testing. And I think for me, the point is we have an excellent vaccination program. We haven't finished it yet. We're not that far from finishing it off, a couple of months maybe, but we haven't finished it yet. So that vaccination program plus better public health measures means that we don't need to reach population immunity through infection. We don't need to let millions more people get infected and then live with the consequences of that down the line. But that seems to be the government's plan, and it's a terrible plan. And that's where I'm going to finish.
Christina, thank you very much for that indeed. Now, before we go to questions from the public, we're going to go to Professor John Drury, who will introduce Independent Sage's new statement on mass events. So John, over to you.
Thanks very much, Alice. So this statement is on behalf of a number of scientists, some of whom have been involved in the events research programme, either carrying out studies or were involved in drawing up the principles that were meant to underlie it. And we share with many other scientists the view that well-designed research should be carried out to enable as many kinds of activities as possible to be carried out eventually. But in terms of the current events research programme, the way it's presented and indeed being exploited suggests to us that it's actually creating risk and is being used politically, which is damaging for the credibility of science. And the first concern we have is that it was assumed at the beginning, when the events research programme was introduced, that the first phase, the findings of the first phase, would be analysed and released and would feed into decisions on the second phase. And this doesn't seem to have happened because the results were only published last week. Phase 2 and phase 3 events have already gone ahead. And compounding this, it's the case that there's been quite a low response rate for those participating in events, which means that the evidence base for the events research programme is relatively low. The second concern we have is in the way that the findings have been presented. Now, if you read the report, you'll see a lot of caution. I mean, from the very beginning, we are cautioned that there is insufficient data, the design is insufficient in scale, in scope to detect direct evidence of transmission from within the event. Now, that is the official statement, but if you look at the headlines in the media, they present this absence of evidence as evidence of absence, and we are told that events are safe. And now, while of course the UK government is not responsible for those headlines, it's done nothing to try to correct them and has let them go. And the third concern we have is in terms of which events get included, because the Science Board had no input into the selection of events. And if you look at the events, I mean, the impression to me from the outside is that they are determined not by scientific concerns, but more to do with things like national prestige. You've got Euro 2020, you've got Wimbledon, or to do with personal connections with the UK government. And so you've got Lloyd Webber's musical, for example. So together, these three concerns create the impression to many of us that decisions have been made about events going ahead politically, for political purposes, rather than based on findings. And this means that the science, the hard work being carried out by many scientists, is serving as a fig leaf for politically based decisions. So in our statement, we've got 4 demands. And the first is that there should be timely release of findings and analysis before moving on to the next stage. And the second is that scientists should be involved in the selection of appropriate events. The third, that scientists should be involved in press briefings on findings. And fourth, we'd also argue that there is an overall lack of openness and transparency in the communication of the programme. And I think, again, it's a political thing. It doesn't come from the scientists. There needs to be transparency in the form of publication, sharing of design and analysis protocols ahead of each study and not just afterwards. Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed, John. And now we're going to open up to questions from the press and the public. First of all, we've got a question from Nigel Nelson of the Sunday People. Nigel.
Thanks, Alice. Good to see you back. Given those rather frightening figures from Christina, just to make it clear, are you suggesting that the current restrictions should remain in place? And if so, for how long? Christina was suggesting probably around about September. Or should there be more restrictions? And if so, what?
Thank you very much, Nigel. And I have heard Christina talking about this quite a bit actually over recent days, and also talking about the fact it's not just about restrictions, it is about other mitigations that could be in place in workplaces and schools, for instance. It's not just about individuals being left to kind of fend for themselves. It's actually what should be happening, what the government should be supporting, safer environments. Christina, can I pass that straight back to you to elaborate on?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly don't think we should be relaxing anything until we're finished our vaccination program. But as Alice said, it's not just about restrictions. It's about doing the things that we know work. It seems like the government's only solutions right now is vaccinating, which is happening, but it's not happening fast enough to prevent the summer wave, and testing. But testing doesn't work if people can't do anything about a positive test. And God knows we've said this so many times over the last year, but it's still not there. We still have the lowest sick rates for people who need to isolate with COVID. We have no support, no practical support, nothing. There's just nothing there to help people. There's nothing there to make spaces safe. There was a really good paper published yesterday with Trish Greenhouse, one of the authors, asking for a paradigm shift where we've got used to clean water from our taps. We've got used to sewage systems. We've got used to all these public health measures. Why aren't we demanding clean air? Why aren't we improving ventilation in our public buildings and workspaces and schools, which is a public health good far beyond just COVID? But we're just not doing it. So I think there's so many more things we could be doing and should be doing to invest in public health and keeping cases down that we aren't doing.
Thank you very much, Christina. I saw some interest amongst the rest of the group in answering this question. Stephen, would you like to pick up on that?
Yeah. A week ago, if people can remember that, I mean, a week is a long time in politics. It seems to be an eternity in this pandemic. A week ago, news was completely dominated by Matt Hancock and his embrace. And at one level, that's a real pity, because there are three things that happened on Friday that I think we should note. I mean, Hancock is one of them. The second was a coruscating report from the National Audit Office, which said that still our test and trace system is not fit for purpose. Still, it's taking about twice as long to contact people as it should, meaning they are wandering around and infecting more people. If we had a test and trace and isolate and support system that worked, we would be bringing down infections by a considerable amount. And it is a huge scandal that we still haven't got it to work. So that's one very clear area when we should be doing better. And the second was a statement from the World Health Organization in which they stressed that vaccines, of course, help us, but they're not enough, that we need the other mitigations. And in particular, we need working test and trace if we're to keep infections down. And so putting those two together, we are told, look, it is critical to complement vaccines with these other measures, and that's not being done in this country. Now, I want to go back to a point that Christina made, which is really important. The irony is that many of those who are talking about lifting restrictions as soon as possible are saying, yeah, but we might have to reimpose them in the autumn. Now, why might we have to reimpose them in the autumn? Because there will be a reservoir by the present policies, there will be a reservoir of infection such that when conditions change and people go back to work and students go back to school and college and people go indoors again, it can spike. And the way to stop that happening, stop the things that various people in government are talking about, is to get rid of that reservoir of infection for once and for all. And that's about those public health measures. So when we talk about measures, we're not talking about restrictions. We're not talking about stopping people doing things. We're talking about supporting people to get tested and contacted, supporting people to self-isolate, and supporting people by providing environments which are not toxic towards them. So let's be absolutely clear. Independent SAGE stands for good public health measures. Independent SAGE does not stand for restrictions. Independent SAGE stands for the measures that stop lockdown. We don't stand for lockdown.
Thank you very much, Steve. And thank you for the question there, Nigel. Moving on now to another question coming from Sarah Saul, who is one of the founder members of Safe Education for All. Sarah, over to you. Are you with us, Sarah?
Muted at the minute.
Ah, you're not now. We can hear you and we can see you, I think. Or we can hear you anyway. Go ahead.
Can you see me now?
Yes.
Hi, thank you everyone for everything you do from Independent SAGE. I'm just asking on behalf of parents who are following the science. We've tried now individually and collectively for a whole academic year to try and get all scientifically recognised mitigations into our UK schools. We've engaged at a local level. We've spoken to our senior leadership teams in our schools that our children attend. We've spoken to local authorities. We've collectively engaged with ministers and journalists and tried to get the message out and tried to ask for the precautionary principle to be applied within our schools. It's not getting us anywhere. We've shared best practice from other countries. We've just asked and tried everything. It seems that all our pleas are falling on deaf ears everywhere we go, from the Labour Party in an opposition role that won't help, to everybody we've asked. What more can parents be doing to stop our children being unnecessarily and knowingly exposed to an increased risk of infection in schools? My 15-year-old son is isolating the second time. He already contracted coronavirus in December last year and took 5 months to return to full health. So I feel for every parent who's trying to do everything they can. What else can we possibly do?
Thank you very much, Sarah, and very much kind of feel your pain and understand your situation. And I know that you're, trying to work on this collectively. And I think you've made it very clear that the risk is not just to our children's health, it's to our children's education. That not having mitigations in schools means that education is more likely to be disrupted. I can see lots of people want to comment on this. We'll start with Dr. Kit Yates, and then I'll come to Dr. Zubaida Huq. Kit.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for your question. Yeah, in sympathy, I feel your pain. I am currently homeschooling my son, who is self-isolating after contacting his class. It's incredibly disruptive for him, having to be taught by some idiots who don't know anything about school, like me and his mum. It's incredibly disruptive for us, having to take time off work. And it's not great for his teachers either. They don't benefit from having this disruption, having to put stuff online. Teachers have been working so incredibly hard. I think all we can do is to keep raising the alarm, to keep saying, why don't we have better ventilation in school? Why don't we have masks back in secondary school? Why was that removed at a time when we knew the Delta variant was about to cause a huge spike in cases? I think this week, last Friday, as Christine's mentioned, we had 370,000 children off school, roughly split between primary and secondary schools, which is astonishing. Over 10,000 of them because whole schools were closed. I find it absolutely astonishing that we are so far into this pandemic. We know there are basic measures that we can use to try to slow down or mitigate the spread, especially in schools where we know spread is happening a lot because people are inside all day. We need to be doing more, and all we can do really is keep raising the alarm and keep pushing these messages out there.
Thank you very much, Kit, and Zubaida, and then I'll come to Professor Susan Michie. Zubaida.
Looking at what's happening in schools, just last week we saw that some 1 in 20 school children were off school because of COVID. We know that schools and classes are closing everywhere across the country because of COVID. We've seen figures from Christina showing that some of the highest infection rates are among school children. I don't think we can do anything but conclude that this government is seriously carrying out its herd immunity policy through natural infection through school children. Now, this week we heard from JCVI, one of the members from JCVI, that actually that's not a problem because we all die at some stage, which was an extraordinary comment, an extraordinary callous comment to make, regardless of what a ridiculous comment to make. But more than that, what we have to think about is it's long COVID. Christina, my colleague, has talked about long COVID. We know that 7 to 8% of children struggle with long COVID. We know what those symptoms are, from fog memory to heart problems, heart palpitation problems, to concentration problems, and so on. But on top of that, this is not a light disease. This is not a negligible disease. We know from the States that some 300 to 400 children have died from COVID, that it's in the top 10 of diseases that kills children in 2020. Now, it is a very serious disease. And we also know that given at the moment children are not vaccinated, that's going to disproportionately impact on children from deprived areas, from Black and ethnic minority groups. We know Black and ethnic minority groups are on average younger than the white population. About a third of Asian children are under the age of 18. About a half of mixed race children are under the age of 18. So this virus, letting the virus rip through schools, will have uneven consequences and will be devastating for children with illnesses and for CEV families as well.
Thank you very much, Zubaida. Professor Susan Michie.
So it sounds like you've just done so much in terms of trying to get the message across. And I absolutely understand your frustration. I think we're all frustrated because we're all failing to get messages across. But I wonder how closely you've been working with the National Education Union, because I remember last year when schools successfully worked and the National Education Union had a very good role in delaying the opening of schools by 2 weeks. And that's when scientists came together with parents, with teachers, governing bodies, local authorities, and it was successful. You know, that was one success that did happen with good consequences. So I think that one sort of way forward is just to think about alliances. You know, who else is that could be allied with to bring people together? Some of us on this call are part of an alliance of scientists, and we're putting together a letter that will be published, I hope, very soon, calling on similar things as you're calling on. So that's my only, and maybe you're already doing this, but that would be my only suggestion in addition to all those things that you're doing. And as Kit said, one has to keep going and not get demoralized, because even if you fail at certain points, sometimes a lot of things change together and suddenly you do begin to get traction.
Thank you very much, Susan. And Sarah, thank you very much for your question today. Moving on to our next questioner now, it is Jennifer Kidd. Jennifer. Are you with us, Jennifer?
Yes. Okay.
Oh, we can see a placemat, but I presume you are there.
Right.
Don't worry, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, well, I'll just carry on. So my question is, rather than having all these pointless and dangerous so-called test events, wouldn't it be better for the government to have comparable events with participants either wearing or not wearing FFP3 masks? The mask could be provided free, and after the event, compulsory home testing could be done, if only with just a sample of participants.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So an idea there for a trial of outside events. I wonder if I could bring you back in to talk about that, John.
Briefly, there's a good question about whether any test events should go ahead at all. I suppose some people might say there shouldn't be any, though my view is there is scope for research. I mean, with basic public health mitigations. I mean, people are aware that as the test events have progressed and as the Euros have progressed, the crowds have got bigger. And that means there's less opportunity for distancing. So, you know, these events, many of them, particularly the outdoor ones, are run in very big venues, whereby if you have a relatively small crowd, you've got sufficient scope for distancing, and a mask wearing should be enforced too. I mean, there was a report written last year that I was involved in for SPI-B that pointed out that the main risk areas were not necessarily within the event where behaviour can be regulated, but travel, pubs beforehand, and gathering at home. And I think some of these figures we've seen in recent days about very high numbers of people infected, they're not just the people at the events, they're people at these other locations, because there too, the government is basically giving the message, it's all fine. Just do what you want now because it's more safe. On the specific proposal, I'm afraid for ethical reasons, we cannot compel people who take part in studies to follow through with testing afterwards. And this is one of the reasons why response rates are low, because it has to be voluntary for ethical reasons. People have to be able to withdraw any time in a study.
Thanks very much, John. And Stephen, you'd like to comment here?
So clearly, you have a future as a scientist, because that's exactly, if you were trying to ask what are the effects of certain mitigations, what you'd have to do. You'd have to have equivalent conditions in which you varied whatever it is that you were interested in. It might be ventilation, it might be distancing, it might be masks, it might be whatever. But in order to do that, of course, you would have to allocate people to equivalent events, and therefore you'd have to have a properly randomized selection of events as well. And that's why the point that John made, that the selection of events is political, means actually that type of science you can't do. The politicization of those choices actually means that you could never compare like with like, because there would be differences between the events in different conditions. And it does seem, and it's very hard not to draw the conclusion that what's happening at the moment is that the government wants to open something. It knows it's going to be controversial, so it tries to avoid the controversy by saying it's a test event. So they want to open the Euros because it would be a real political problem not to. It's a test event. They want Wimbledon to go ahead because they would upset a lot of their supporters if Wimbledon didn't go ahead. It's a test event. The same for Silverstone, even though some of the drivers themselves, including Lewis Hamilton, say they think it's a bit of a daft idea. And the problem with that, and I think it's really serious, is number one, it means we don't have the proper political debate. I think it would be reasonable to have a political debate which asked, are we prepared to take the risk of greater infections in order for the Euros to go ahead? And the huge amount of pleasure that gives a lot of people, and a huge amount of misery it leads to in Scotland, I should say. But nonetheless, we could have a proper political debate. But if all you do is you say, oh, well, it's a test event, so let's not even have a debate about the risks, it means you can't mitigate against those risks because you haven't admitted to them. So I think it would be reasonable. But the point is that, and again, going back to John's point, that the major risk isn't in the stadium. It's probably not in the pubs. 60,000 people at Wembley is one thing. 60 million people at home hugging each other and so on while watching the game is a far greater issue. That's where you've got to intervene. That's where you've got to give clear messages. That's where you've got to say to people, this is how to keep yourself safe. Yet we're getting none of that messaging, nothing to help people watch the Euros, enjoy them and keep themselves safe, because the fig leaf that it's science means you won't admit to the risks and you won't do anything about them. And so it's a truly toxic cocktail that we've got as a result.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and a really important point that you raised there about honesty in decision making. And I think that there would be more, well, obviously much more trust if there wasn't honesty underlying the way that decisions are being made, when you can see that they're not being made for the reasons that they are being spoken about. Zubaida.
Just a quick comment. I find it intriguing that when the government designated so many mass popular events like Silverstone, like Wembley and other places as research events and Wimbledon as research events, that they didn't designate parliamentary people, parliamentary MPs sitting together in Parliament to make decisions, to undertake their role of scrutiny as a research event as well. And I do think that that's quite interesting, that right now we have all these mass events going on, that mass events will open up even more after July the 19th, and yet there is nothing said about Parliament sitting until before September.
Thank you very much, Zubaida. Thank you very much for that question. And moving on now to a question coming in from Sam DC. Sam, are you with us?
Hello, good afternoon.
Hello.
Everybody. Don't think I can start the video, but I'll speak anyway. I'm with Zubaida today in my mind. I think the government is clearly pursuing a herd immunity strategy amongst our children. I'm slightly astounded by this, but could it be argued that there is any method in this madness?
Thank you very much. Yeah. Sorry, was there another part?
Let this run through our kids rather than vaccinate them?
Yeah, great question. I wonder if Professor Carl Friston would like to tackle that. Is there any kind of rationality to this idea, do you think, Carl?
From an epidemiological point of view, probably not. But I think there are obviously lots of key arguments for both sides of the argument. I think that if you want to have that argument, there's an important move, which in part speaks to Sarah Saul's question earlier on about, how can you get the right frame of reference to, to have this argument? And I think that move has to be away from mortality and towards morbidity. So we know that the vaccines can, in principle, break the link between infection and death or mortality. What is evident is it's not breaking the link between infection and morbidity, be that long COVID or the very rare instances of severe systemic disease that you can get in children. So if I was answering Sarah's question, I think one way to get the message across is to change the narrative and ask about what are the consequences of letting the virus run wild from the point of view of disease burden. And there are lots of examples of this. So, for example, mumps is a respiratory virus that has a basic reproduction ratio, which is not dissimilar to SARS-CoV-2 at the moment with the Delta variant. It can cause illnesses of a very mild sort, but in a small number of people, it can cause viral encephalitis. And if you've been the parent of a child with a viral encephalitis, this is not the sort of mild illness that you would, expose your children to. In later life, it can cause orchiditis. It can render your children sterile. So there are, I think, arguments that are framed not in terms of people dying, but in terms of the unknown consequences of not vaccinating children at this stage. So I don't have an answer, but what in order to formulate, I think, a valid answer, we need to know a lot more about the morbidity that can be induced by pediatric infections with SARS-CoV-2. And Christina's already said, there's clear evidence of neurological complications in adults, and it's highly unlikely that children will be, if you like, immune from that kind of complication. And indeed, in the United States, about 1 in 2,000 people now have multi-system inflammatory syndromes. This, I think, is very worrying, just because we don't know it's not going to happen with SARS-CoV-2. Imagine in 5 years' time, it turns out to be like mumps, and we let it rip over the next few months, when we could have had the opportunity, as Christina said, just to follow through with an appropriate vaccination. So it's a really vexed question, and it's going to have to be answered in the very near future.
Thank you very much, Carl. And Kit would like to comment as well, and then briefly Christina as well. Kit.
So we have vaccines. We know that they work extremely well. Vaccines have been approved for 12 to 17-year-olds by the MHRA. We're just waiting on a decision for the JCVI. In terms of benefits to kids, it stops them getting COVID and getting the potential complications that Carl's outlined. It stops them potentially from getting long COVID as well. So the sort of symptoms that Christina outlined can be severely debilitating. Brain fog, especially in young people, is really something we'd like to avoid. It also stops disruption to education, because it means that we don't have to isolate whole classes once people have been vaccinated. It brings cases down in school, and that's clearly a good thing. It also indirectly protects the teachers that have to stay in the classrooms with students for many, many hours a day. For a population point of view, which is I think what the argument is about whether we reach herd immunity or not, certainly vaccinating children is a safe way of giving a large swathe of our population immunity. And even if we don't reach a nominal herd immunity threshold, the more people we get vaccinated, the more people who are immune to this disease, the easier it becomes to control this disease. So for me, this idea that if you're older than 18, it's fine to be vaccinated, but as soon as you become younger than 18, it's not okay to be vaccinated. I find that a bit strange, and I think we should be hearing from JCVI really soon about whether we are going to be given approval for vaccinating children.
Thank you very much, Kit. And vaccination has been approved in other countries. We seem to be a bit of an outlier in deciding that catching the infection is better than being vaccinated. Very quick word from you, Christina, please.
Yeah, I just want to say that I think part of the problem is that we don't measure morbidity. We don't measure illness or long-term ill health routinely. And so we kind of concentrated and obsessed as a country on the indicators that we measure every day, which is cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. And so we can effectively put out of our heads all the other consequences of COVID. So I think part of the issue is measurement and thinking about what we measure. And I actually think we should be trying to measure and track and make public the other indicators that matter, which is differences by deprivation, long COVID, longer term consequences, disruption to schooling, which get published but in lots of different places and irregular intervals and aren't as reported. So I think that is part of the issue, is thinking about how we measure and how we talk about this disease.
Thank you very much, Christina. And Sam, thank you very much for your question. Moving on now to a question coming in from a teacher, Marie Martin. Marie, are you with us?
I am. I hope you can hear me.
We can.
Okay, perfect. So my name is Marie. I'm a teacher. I work in a secondary school, big secondary school in Leicestershire, and my head has been amazing in that is reinstated masks wearing in classrooms. So I work with a brilliant team of SLT. This is my question. With the variant being rife in schools, what is the risk of a further mutation? Is it random or can it be quantified? And if a mutation is likely, has it got the risk of being more dangerous, specifically for young people, as this is the population the government is letting the variant rip through? I'm very interested in this because I'm a parent and I look after a lot of amazing young people, and I care immensely about them. And I want to know whether they're really at further risk of a nasty mutation of the virus. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marie. Professor Martin McKee, would you like to start with this one?
I would like to try to answer this, and really this is the $64,000 question. So we've been thinking a great deal about that. In fact, I've been working with a group of colleagues from across Europe to basically make our best guess as to where we're going with all of this. The thing with the SARS-CoV-2 virus is that it has to fit into a receptor in cells, and as it mutates, some of the mutations will make it a better fit, a tighter fit, and some of the mutations will make it easier to enter the cells afterwards, and some of the mutations will make it a less good fit. And if that is the case, then it will become less virulent, and that's happening all the time anyway. And the ones that emerge and take off are the ones that are the better fit. The question is there an infinite number of variations that could arise that would still manage to fit within the receptor? Probably not. But the number that could arise could be a quite large number, and that's what we're really not sure about. So at some stage, ultimately, we're likely to see all or most of these emerge. And I think there are also going to be advances in the vaccines as well, which are going to be repurposed to focus on the most similar ones. What we are seeing is that we're seeing a few signs that there are slight variations on mutations that we've already seen, like the Lambda variant that is now going very prominently in Latin America, which has a mutation on the same site as the Delta variant, but a different mutation. And we're still trying to work out what's happening there. So the question, is it random? Well, yes, it is random, but then conditions determine whether or not the variant then thrives or doesn't thrive. And we almost certainly don't have an infinite number of variants that are likely to arise, but whether it's a large number or a very large number is one that we're not sure about yet. I'm not sure if that answers the question. It's just because it's a very difficult question, to be perfectly honest, but one we are thinking about a lot.
I think it partially answered it, Martin, but it is evolutionary, isn't it? So if you have a large population, if there's a large population of virus, there's a higher likelihood of variants popping up.
Absolutely.
Dr. Kate Yates.
So I think, it is random, but that doesn't mean it can't be quantified. The more people that it infects, the more chances it has to replicate. And it's when it's replicating that you get these mutations coming in. Like Martin says, some of them will make no difference. Some of them will make that particular virus particle worse, and some of them will make it better potentially. And it's the ones that make it better that will potentially go on and spread and become the dominant one. So that's what we worry about. There is this touted idea of what's called the law of declining virulence, where things eventually maybe get more transmissible but less serious over time. This is what people have suggested is going to happen with SARS-CoV-2. Unfortunately, there's very little evidence. This is not a well-established scientific law, so there's no reason to believe that as time goes on, this will necessarily get less virulent, less serious as time goes on.
Thank you very much, Kit. I mean, certainly from a perspective, the long view of paleopathology, we see both extremes happening. So we see diseases that have become less virulent over time, but we also see diseases that have become significantly more virulent over time as well. Right, I'm going to move on to another question now coming from Robert Jones. Robert, are you there?
Yes, I'm a retired veterinary surgeon, and I was part of the never fully deployed foot and mouth vaccination task force during the Guildford outbreak. So I'm very interested in all the discussion about herd immunity. And my question is, are there any restrictions, sorry to use that word again, that you would consider pointless or counterproductive that we can afford to remove? And what are the ones that you'd want to you consider necessary and that we actually have to live with for some time to come?
Thank you very much, Robert. I mean, what a fantastic question, because our ideas about how this virus transmits have changed a bit over time as more evidence has come in. And I think that there's, a certain amount of what we're doing which could be considered to be hygiene theatre, and other things which are absolutely essential to stopping it spread. So has anybody got any comments here? What could we drop? And then what should we keep in place? Martin?
Yeah, I'm not really convinced that Perspex screens indoors make much difference when we know that this is an airborne virus. I'm delighted that people do sanitize their hands, but how much protection it actually gives you, I'm not entirely sure, but I wouldn't discourage it because it's generally good practice anyway, but it's the Perspex screens that really get me.
I'm always surprised by people in television studios thinking that they're completely safe sitting in a television studio for half an hour to an hour because they're 2 meters apart as well. Not thinking about duration and shared air. Susan?
I think we should be thinking about the long term, because it's not just this pandemic. Sadly, there are going to be future pandemics, and we don't know what the nature of future pandemics is going to be in terms of what kind of transmission it's going to be. So I would have thought it makes sense for us as a society to really begin thinking about what kind of hygiene behaviours could we adopt that we haven't been adopting in recent times, because we move forward in other areas. I remember a time when I was young when people didn't routinely wear seatbelts or avoid drink driving or not speed. These things were done, but things have moved on, and people have adopted all sorts of safety practices in terms of traffic, which has massively reduced not only death, but also disability on a large scale. So given that a lot of these kind of measures of disinfecting hands and surfaces, of carrying tissues, even carrying face masks if you need to use it, are not burdensome, and thinking about the safe context, thinking as a society, how can we make our spaces safer, like we have now, which we didn't used to have in cafes and restaurants. We've got hygiene ratings on the walls. Let's have those extended to cover airborne diseases as well as fomite surface diseases. So I think it's a conversation to have. I think the whole population should be engaged in that conversation, but I think it should be in terms of how do we maximize the chance that we don't get future pandemics, and that if we do, we get out of them as quickly as possible and we don't have to have lockdowns. So much better to change a few behaviours at scale across the population, try and make them routine and habitual, rather than get into the terrible situation we're in at the moment.
Thank you very much for that, Susan, and also for broadening out the answer there to the question to not just thinking about restrictions and personal restrictions, but thinking about mitigations much more generally. Steve?
Yeah, so I was going to continue that theme, and language does matter here, because if you talk in terms of restrictions, then people will always resist them and assert their autonomy. It's a psychological process called reactance. And as Susan has pointed out, culturally, we always respond to changes in our understanding of society with changes in our culture. And I do think that we need to think very profoundly, for instance, about space and about what we think about space and how we treat space. After the Spanish flu pandemic, it impacted architecture in a huge way and the notion of the nature of domestic spaces. And again, I think we need to think about housing. It always amazes me how low housing is on the political agenda when it's so fundamental to our experience. But what we found in this pandemic is people get infected because they're restricted, because their houses are too small, because they're crammed together, because they don't have enough space. So what are we going to do to lead to less restriction, better housing, larger housing, more affordable housing? What are we going to do in terms of our relationship to nature, the relationship between the indoors and the outdoors, and the ways in which we organize activities in different ways? And we organize our housing so that we seal ourselves off from the outside. So to me, the real question is not to think in terms of restrictions, but to think in terms of how do we literally build back better a society in which we use space and relate to nature in a better way. And not only would that be a safer world, I think it would be a far better and more enjoyable world to live in. So, let's put housing on the agenda in a big way, and the affordability of housing. And I think that would make, as we already know, I mean, in the end, the beginnings of public health go back to the understanding of how bad housing makes people unwell. Well, let's get better housing in the future, because you can't talk about health without talking about that.
Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. And just fitting in another couple of questions here. So, question coming in from Kira McLaverty. Kira. Are you here with us? Oh, I might have to come back to you if you're not here imminently. So we'll go to Peter Shreve, who I'm hoping is here and able to ask his question. Peter, are you there?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Good
Lovely.
afternoon. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to raise this on behalf of all those people working in schools. And I'd just like to comment on your group member, Susan, who suggested a positive alliance with groups like the National Education Union, and declared that I am the Assistant District Secretary of the National Education Union on the Isle of Wight, and would consider it certainly an avenue worth pursuing. England's new Children Commissioner and others feel pupils should not have to self-isolate if somewhere in their school bubble tests positive for COVID. This, to me, feels somewhat bold in the light of worries, turn that off. This feels somewhat bold in the light of worries about new variants, the inexorable rise in school cases and absences in the effects of long COVID, so that schools can get back to normal as soon as possible and as safely as possible. Apart from the usual masks, better ventilation and more frequent testing, what additional mitigations could be taken? And finally, what is the realistic likelihood of having a September normality for schools?
Thank you very much, Peter. I mean, it's an interesting question about mitigations, because obviously we know that the principal mitigations like ventilation are not being effectively deployed in schools at the moment. So there's a lot we could be doing that we're not doing yet. Zubaida, did I see your hand up?
Yes, I mean, Peter, I am so frustrated. We're all so frustrated and dismayed at where we're at with schools, where here we are 16 months in and there are no mitigations. And just when I thought that I had got my head around it, we heard this week, the Children's Commissioner and others talking about getting rid of literally the only mitigation we have left in schools, which is self-isolation. It's literally the only thing we have. So getting rid of self-isolation is really letting the virus rip through primary and secondary schools. We know primary schools, didn't have face masks. We know in primary schools there was no lateral flow testing. So I don't know what else there would be to buffer the spread of an incredibly transmissible Delta variant in the schools. And that does lead to September and what's going to happen, given that we know that come autumn, infection rates are likely to go up again. And I think even by then we won't have children vaccinated. So it really does leave me pondering, what else is there? That said, we've known from the outset, as Alice has said, what needs to be done. We've said from the outset that we need better ventilation in schools, we need better air purifiers in schools, we need smaller class sizes, we need children to be spread out much more, we need face masks reinstated in secondary schools, we need all of those things. And the government have the summer. I mean, quite honestly, the government have had many an opportunity, many a break where they could have done more, but they have this summer. And if they don't do that, then our children will really be left exposed, because they won't be vaccinated, there won't be any mitigation measures, and they will have taken a self-isolation, which is the only thing that breaks the chain of transmission.
Thank you very much, Zubaida. And Susan.
Well, Zubaida mentioned it in passing, but I did want to raise this issue about the class sizes, because it's always helpful to look at countries across the world in this situation. We've done spectacularly badly in the UK, and we have to ask ourselves, why have we done so badly? We know that we've got one of the most countries with one of the most crowded classrooms certainly in Europe. And they don't have to be like this, just as Steve talked about housing. We should step back and really look at the society we are in and what we're doing to our population and doing to our children, that we don't have to. There's a lot of money in this country. It's very unevenly distributed, but it doesn't have to be. So we called many times last year for this, right at the beginning, to use a lot of the closed buildings, hotels and other buildings that weren't being used, that have large rooms that could accommodate classes of children. Another thing that was never taken up, but it's not too late to think about those things. So, I mean, it is frustrating when sensible, rational solutions that could be a win-win are not taken up. But I don't think we should leave that off the agenda. I think, in that list of mitigations that Zubaida outlined, I think having larger spaces with fewer children is an obvious one.
Thank you very much, Susan. I remember, months ago when we were discussing this and saying that actually there was a staff issue as well there, and that would require more teachers. But we've had 18 months to train up more teachers, and actually we could have plugged the gap with teaching assistants as well. And there's been a complete absence of any intention to do that. And of course, what we've seen is small bubbles, which are large anyway, because our class sizes are large in Britain compared with most other countries, have become larger and larger and larger, meaning that when a bubble isolates, it affects often hundreds of children rather than that idea of keeping small bubbles. Kit, brief word from you, please.
Yeah, really quickly. I mean, you've mentioned all the measures that we want to put in schools. The only other thing that you didn't mention, Peter, that we could be doing is vaccination. And people have said to me, well, vaccination isn't going to fix the problem at the moment of 370,000 school children isolating, but we want to stop this happening in September. Kids have had the worst time. They've been so unfairly impacted by this disease. They've had 2 periods when schools have been entirely closed. It's just absolutely crazy. And yet we're still not doing everything that we can to try to make sure that schools aren't in that situation again and that children aren't missing out on their education. So as well as all the other benefits of vaccinating children, protecting them from ill health issues, that's another thing that can be done to stop them from missing school.
Thank you very much, Kit. I want to squeeze in one final question, which continues with this theme, and it is Chiara McClaverty. Chiara, are you here now?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, you can.
Yes. Well, yeah, it was covered previously, but really just how can NDSAGE help protect our children against herd immunity by force, which is what it feels like.
So we've talked about potential solutions here. We've talked about what parent groups are doing. What could Independent Sage be doing as a group to try to bring about some of these changes that we know will make the school environment so much safer for our children?
Yep.
I'd like to hear from you, Gabriel, actually. I've not heard from you today. Do you think you could comment on this?
It's a very difficult thing. Independent Sage has been trying for a very long time to do something about schools. It's a year now since we were advocating a whole range of measures. And as Zubaida has said, not a single thing has happened. It's really, really quite remarkable. And it does make you think that I don't know if the government is still thinking of herd immunity, or whether they just don't care and they think children are kind of nothing to worry about, and it's not a problem, and they're just going to have to maybe reverting to Boris Johnson's take it on the chin, except it's someone else's chin, isn't it? It's kids. And we have explained repeatedly that this is not risk-free, and we know, and Christina mentioned, Ciara, at the beginning about the incidence of long COVID, and also mentioned the fact that we don't know what the natural history of this virus is and what long-term effects. And I keep having this haunting thought of what I learned as a young doctor about the aftermath of Spanish flu and the epidemic of Parkinson's disease that followed some years later. I think one of the things that Independence Age should do is that we should properly advocate for a much more integrated approach to school health. It seems to me that that has been neglected. And it is interesting that the School Health Service was extraordinarily strong at a time when we wanted to improve the health of children at the beginning of the 20th century, largely driven by there not being enough fit young men to fight for the empire. But it had a remarkable effect. And there was a school officer of educational health in every local authority, and there was a large number of school nurses developed over the years. And one of the things that I would love to see is we went back to the situation where every school had a school nurse who had a real role in keeping those children healthy and helping the school integrate health into the curriculum and the activities of the school. But rather than that, over the last 10 years, we've seen a drop of a third in the number of school nurses, whole-time equivalents employed in England. And that isn't good enough. It's gone down from 3,000 to 2,000. It hasn't moved really during the pandemic at all. Yet, on the other hand, one of the first things New York did was they started recruiting school nurses, and they set themselves the target of having a school nurse for every public school in the whole of New York. And I think what Independence Age could do, maybe we should do something on educational medicine, educational health, and come up with a strategy for the improvement of educational health that we would then work with the teaching unions, work with parent groups, and really put school health on the agenda for once and for all.
Thank you very much for that, Gabriel. And Chiara, thank you for that challenge. And I think that Zubaida would like to have a final word on that as well.
Very quick one, which is I find it extraordinary that the government acknowledged and recognised and partially addressed vulnerability in adults in terms of illnesses and prioritised those adults for vaccination, and yet are completely silent about vulnerability of illness in terms of illnesses among children. We know a high proportion of children have diabetes, have asthma, are recovering from cancer. We know there's a high proportion of obesity, and all of these factors are high risk factors for getting COVID and being hospitalized with COVID. And it's just extraordinary that there's absolutely no recognition of that. And instead, we see children being treated as a homogenous group who are all fit and healthy. And I think we need to remind them about that. We need to remind them that adult vulnerability doesn't come out of nowhere.
Thank you very much, Zubaida. It may feel as though children have been abandoned in this, but Independence Age will not abandon children. I'm going to wrap it up there and ask Sir David for his final words as usual. Sir David King.
Thank you very much, Alice. I'm going to start by quoting from our note that we issued into the public domain 1 year into the pandemic. This was in mid-March this year. And I'm just going to read the first line. 1 year into the pandemic, Independence Age issued a warning that complacency and over-reliance on vaccine risks a catastrophic fourth wave. Now, it's not with any satisfaction that I say, once again, our warning was correct. And once again, we haven't actually managed to avoid what was a foreseeable outcome. And here we are at now 28,000 cases per day of COVID being reported in the country. Now, we've just had a very, very important discussion amongst the experts, and I couldn't possibly summarize it, except to say what we're saying is allowing this disease to run rife amongst our school children is producing so many obvious risks and so many possible risks that this is really something that the government needs to focus on. And all of the things Independence Age has been saying, including, please, let's vaccinate the 12 to 18-year-olds, all of these things have not been enacted on. And we just feel extremely frustrated once again that our advice and the discussions ensuing from our advice have not really been followed at all. So Let me just also comment on the biggest single failure since the failure to act quickly back in February, March last year, has of course been the failure of the find, test, trace, and supported isolation system. We have never favored lockdown over a system of separating out the people with the disease and those who've been in contact with them from the rest of the population. Then we could all get on with our lives. Yes, then we could watch football matches or whatever we want to do if that policy had been properly put in place. Now, one policy has been properly put in place, and this was, of course, the vaccination program. The rollout of vaccination has been very successful. And I just want to stress again, this was run through the public National Health Service and general practice system that has been operating so well in the country. Whereas the find, test, trace, isolate, and support system was run beginning in May last year through new private companies financed entirely out of the public purse. And those private companies had zero healthcare experience. And their boards also have very, very minimal healthcare experience. So in a way, it's not surprising that these private companies installed very rapidly during a pandemic, instead of using the National Health Service and funding it properly to do this, that doing that has resulted in failure, and over £100 billion spent on that failure. Now, we've all suffered as a result of this. And I think when I say we've all suffered, we are all suffering from lockdown. The whole country has suffered from the restrictions placed on us. But of course, we're approaching 150,000 deaths in the country. What we've learned today is why we now have long COVID, 1 million people living with this in this country, and 385,000 for over a year. In other words, more than the 12 weeks that defines long COVID is those who've spent a year with long COVID, with potential very significant lifetime consequences for those people. So I think what we need is government action that will correct all of these issues. We're not out of it. We're not out of it. And we really want to see proper action. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir David. Thank you very much to all of the scientists of Independent Sage who volunteer their expertise and their time here every week to listen to concerns and questions from the public. Thank you for everybody who's watching, whether you're watching us live or catching up. And we urge you to take care in the coming weeks. The national conversation has shifted to imply that this growing number of cases doesn't matter, and this couldn't be further from the truth, as we've learned today. Independent Sage wants absolutely nothing more than to get to as close a return to normal as we can, but clearly this won't happen if we're letting cases rip through the population. All of our reports, including the new open letter that we've discussed today, are on the website. Please follow us on Twitter and Instagram if you don't already, and please continue to send us your questions and engage with us that way as well. Stay safe, keep well, and see you next week.
Thanks. Bye-bye.